I'm Rumena Bužarovska. I'm assistant professor of American literature at the St. Cyril and Methodius University in Skopje. I'm also a writer and a translator of literature, and I translate from English into Macedonian. I've translated so far 2 novels by Coetzee, The Life and Times of Michael K., Disgrace. I've translated Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. That was rough. Also, a novel by a Welsh writer, Richard Gwyn, The Color of a Dog Running Away. I've translated some poetry, notably Bukowski's poetry into Macedonian, and also Macedonian writers into English. One thing that I did was I translated a Macedonian anthology of haiku poetry. There was a trend of writing haiku poetry in Macedonia for some reason. I did an anthology I translated into English. When I translate something from Macedonian into English, I feel that, you obviously have to kind of choose a culture in which you translate it into. So then, what's that culture going to be? Is it American? Is it going to be British? Is it going to be Australian? What is it? Of course, the colloquial language that you choose will definitely will portray the particular culture and class. So choosing that is a difficulty. I noticed that also with my stories. When I try to avoid translating my stories because I don't want to impose, let's say, a culture or a language on my characters that may not be natural to me. So I'm always thinking maybe my translators should make that decision. And then every time I read my text, something that I wrote that has been translated into English, it's like somebody else wrote it for a while, and I become aware of the things that I dislike in my writing as well. So I find that educational for myself. But on the other hand, I'm also thinking maybe if I translated my stuff, I would probably choose an American context because I'm familiar with it. But then why not allow another translator to choose a different context? So those are, for me, maybe the most challenging bits. Which culture do you transfer it to? And of course, you just, as a non-native speaker, you don't know those nuances. You become aware of them later on. And then there's the challenge of actually transferring a different culture into your own culture. But I always think, okay, we are living in this world of fantastic technology. We are traveling to space. If somebody built a ship and traveled to space, I can translate this book. It's not impossible. Of course, you lose things, but you gain other things. So when I'm translating, I'm trying not to think of loss, that I'm going to lose this dimension in the particular language that I'm from English in my case. I'm thinking, okay, maybe I'll lose it, but then I'll make up for it in a different section where I use a specific Macedonian form that really signifies something that maybe the writer could not have used in English. So there's always a way to compensate. That's one thing. Another question is whether you domesticate the translation. I'm very much against domestification. I think you need to be as true to the culture and the language of the original, however, making it sound natural to the language that you're translating in. For instance, I was wondering, in terms of domestification, I was wondering if I should translate Lewis Carroll I should transfer it into a Macedonian environment. So instead of saying Tweedledum and Tweedledee, I do Stanko and Manko or something like that, like 2 rhyming names that sound very Macedonian. Manko does not sound Macedonian. I have to think of something else, but Vlatko and Ratko, something like that. So there's those kinds of things. Or what do you do with the Jabberwock? I mean, you could completely put that into a Macedonian context and just not have those words, as many writers have done with Alice in translation. But I did not domesticate it because I felt that I was taking an approach for adults. I was thinking this is not going to be a children's book. It can be a children's book, but I wanted adults to be able to read and understand what Lewis Carroll was doing. So I wanted to have the particular English culture transferred into the translation. Because then what happens if you domesticate to the extent that you have to then take all the geographical places and transfer the geography into your country, into your culture? That seemed a little bit, if you can take it a little bit too far in that sense. So for me, domestification is basically adaptation. I don't like to adapt to that extent. I think there are many circumstances where you can, especially where children's books are concerned. There is a great challenge in using those, let's say, international words that have become a part of our everyday language. And in a sense, we have to admit that they're there and that we use them in our everyday language. That sometimes it's very, even if you use another word that you can find in a rural speech or in old dictionaries or in very old texts, people are not going to understand it. So where do you draw the limit? At the same time, English is becoming so prevalent that not only are we adapting these words like empatia for empathy or intimnost for intimacy, where we may have had our own words to use, let's say more Slavic words or Macedonian words. But now we are also adapting the syntax of English. English has become so prevalent that, for instance, we are now literally translating the phrase "have a nice day" or "have a nice evening," which is something that is completely unnatural for the Macedonian language, but it's there. For a while, I was fighting it, and then I thought, okay, maybe I should just stop fighting it, just like all these other internationalisms came in. But what I think I keep telling people, I'm not a purist. I'm not against languages entering our language and adapting to the language. I am against laziness and us not actually exploring the other variations that we have in our language and using synonyms. Rather, I'm against us resorting to the simplest things, which is all these English words that we hear every day from the reports that we read or the newspaper articles that we see every day in the news. So I teach translation at the university, and I encourage my students to always give me at least 3 or 4 synonyms, just to make them think that, yeah, there are other words. And I'm sometimes astonished at how little we know our own language. And for me, that's always a realization, how much more there is in the language than what I am aware of. In Macedonia, there's this notion that our language is poor, that we don't have that many synonyms for things. It's definitely not as rich as English in terms of synonyms. We have other ways in which our language is more, where it can flourish, let's say in the nuances of whether something in proximity, or in terms of how big something is, or whether you're endeared to it, or the extent to which you do a certain thing, like in terms of verbs. Whether you do it a little, a lot, whether you started doing it. Also, we have this beautiful way of expressing whether we witnessed something in the past or we didn't witness something in the past. So not just we, but anybody else. So those are the nuances, the richness that exists in the Macedonian language, but maybe we do not have that many synonyms. But sometimes I am astonished to find that there are a lot of words that I'm just not aware of. And I realized that when I was reading the translations of our great translators, Dragi Mihailovski, who translated everything by Shakespeare into Macedonian, and Ognan Čemirski, who unfortunately passed away, who translated Moby Dick into Macedonian. And when you read Ognen's translation of Moby Dick, you're just astonished at what he's doing with language. And it's not just all these words that he came up with, that he remembered, or that he found that exist, but also these words that he coined. And I think what we need maybe is to feel free to coin words. I see that ability in English. What we keep on doing is just taking all these coined words and just, adding Macedonian suffixes to them instead of actually coining our own. And coining is a really intelligent and fun process. So that's something I think we should continue working on in ways of enriching our language. How people read in Macedonia is a very interesting question. I think it needs research. I haven't run into any kind of data about this, but so everything that I'll say is just my own experience, my impression of it. First, people are saying that that they're not reading, that people are no longer reading. I don't think that's true. I haven't. First, I don't see any measurements of how much people were reading in the past, so that people can compare that. But I keep thinking that every generation says about the next one that, oh, these people don't read, we were smarter, blah, 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 blah. What I notice is that a lot of people are reading Macedonian writers, which didn't happen before. So I see a lot of reading centered around independent, small bookstores. It's a small scene, but it's thriving. So every time there's a book launch, not just a domestic book launches are always very successful. I'm talking about foreign writers that nobody ever heard of being promoted in Macedonia, and especially if the writer is there seems to be, there's quite a crowd. And I go around ex-Yugoslav countries a lot, and I don't see this everywhere. So I think we're doing pretty well in terms of the literary scene, how people going to book launches, listening to people read, asking them questions, being involved. I think that's a positive trend. I'm not sure that libraries are doing really well. That's something that we need to work on. But I don't have that much information about it. I especially don't know what it's like in the smaller places. The other towns sometimes don't even have a bookstore, so the only thing that they have is the library. I'm hoping that ordering books online and getting them through the post service is going to flourish. I hope that electronic books are going to become more popular, especially for domestic writers. I really don't see many book clubs. It's not something that we do. So generally, it's just independent, and now more and more, it's being marketed through Facebook, Twitter, other social networks. There's also, of course, the kind of more popular bookstores that sell kind of pop literature, but that's also thriving. I think that's also working pretty well. So I can't really complain about that scene, the reading scene in Macedonia. I think it's pretty good. The most difficult thing is translating the tenses. And when somebody has witnessed or not witnessed something, and when sometimes there's this particular form that we have in Macedonian that's used when you're trying to be ironic. And so the speaker is ironically addressing something, like addressing a story, narrating a story of that happened to somebody else. And you miss that irony. It's the L form. And then he saw, and it's like saying supposedly, allegedly. But it can become kind of mocking if you say that in Macedonian. Also, there's these verbs like if you want to say he broke something a little bit, he broke the vase a little bit. it would be like crack the vase, but it's not the same. Yeah, potkrši instead of just krši. Krši means to break. Skrši means to completely break. Potkrši to break a little bit. Those kind of things. Skokna is to jump. Podskokna to jump a little bit. Then there's like other prefixes that you can use to show whether the action is completed, whether they did something a little bit, whether they started doing something and then stopped. Those are these little nuances that are, really difficult to translate into English. There's another thing that we do when we talk when we're informal. We'll say let's have a beer, and they're not going to say pivo. They're going to say pivce, which is a little beer, and people use it for everything. In that way, they make something sound less threatening than it actually is. So, for instance, if they want to take a diazepam, they're going to say, take a diazepamce, right? Which is like, just take a little cute diazepam and everything's going to be fine. You do that. They do that for pills. We do that for pills all the time and for things that could be potentially threatening. But you have that in the Russian language. It's just diminutive forms, but just the extent to which you use them. And sometimes even deciding where to use them in the language where something else exists in English, like good old, for instance, doesn't exist in Macedonian. And people are just translating it literally. Doesn't really mean anything. But sometimes for good old, if you put a diminutive on the noun, it could work. That's what it means. It means something that you're already familiar with, but not everywhere. Depending on what good old actually means in that sentence, you could use the diminutive, but not always. So you're going to have to find different ways of using grammar, in fact, to translate some phrases in English that are fixed. Okay, with Huckleberry Finn, a huge, huge challenge is how to translate the N-word. This is something that doesn't really, that's disputed in America. This book is still being censored. So what do you do in Macedonian? We never experienced that kind of problem with racism. So how do you translate a word which has all of these significant meanings? And in fact, it turns out that then you have to translate it differently, I think, now from this perspective, that you would probably have to translate it differently depending on who's speaking and in which context the person is speaking. So it doesn't just have to be one word. In English, it could be one word, but then in Macedonian, perhaps you could use one word, but then the way in which you use the definite article, if you attach it to the word, could signify a lot of things. So if it's just a normal definite article, it could be neutral. But if it's the definite article that says that I'm seeing something over there, then that could be pejorative. So then perhaps depending on who's speaking in which context, you could be using it that way. Inat is a word it's basically stubbornness or hard-headedness. Hard-headed people are inaitchi. You also have that beautiful word. I would love to see more inat in Macedonia. I've seen some in the past 5 or 6 years, but I think inat is actually a good thing. Like hard-headedness is not a positive thing as well, right? But in certain situations it works. It shows that you have stamina. It also shows that you're determined. So, in that sense, inat can be very subversive. I choose to see inat that way. One word that I really dislike in Macedonian, not word, of course I love the word, but it's itar. Itar means someone who's cunning, but who's able to fool other people through their cunningness, right? And it's an admired characteristic because we have a folk hero called Itar Peo, who is always kind of able to fool other people through his little trick. Basically, Itar Peo is the trickster figure. But he's not an admirable figure at all. because he's pulling all these silly tricks, and people are and he's getting his way, but he has really no he has no value as a person. All he's able to do is just get his way through lying, and also doing it through sometimes even the tricks that he pulls are not very intelligent also. But it's a way in which you kind of get through society. A lot of people are saying, you need to be more itar in order to succeed. And I see that as a negative characteristic of our society. There's a Macedonian writer, contemporary Macedonian writer, and a colleague of mine who translated Huckleberry Finn, and she had this issue. The book was actually published in the form that she didn't approve. Kalina Malaska is her name, and she wrote a wonderful short story collection called My Enemy Itarpeo, where she discusses this, in fact. Seir is an amazing word that's very difficult to describe. Seir means that you're sitting somewhere and that you're enjoying the misfortunes and the pains of someone else, but looking at them, in fact. So it's a form of ridicule that's supposed to be also kind of private, where you're kind of just sitting at the, you just imagine that you're sitting somewhere in a little cafe, then somebody walks by and they slip and they fall, and what you did, you laughed because you were watching Seir. You were just enjoying some kind of a misfortune. But Seir is not really serious. You can't really watch Seir, we say, if something really horrible happens to someone. I think they're just kind of like little slips, misfortunes. It's a form of social ridicule that people enjoy. Yeah, gender and language is a particularly interesting topic from many aspects. One aspect is, of course, the positive characteristics that are given to cool male figures like Mangup and Fraer. Trying to think of others. If I'll come up with any others, I'll mention them later. And normally, I was reading about this. It's not just in Macedonian. But also, I was reading about somebody who did a paper on this in Bosnian dictionaries. And in fact, that you would have many synonyms where the masculine form is presented of something like mangup or fraer or some positive male characteristic. But if you had a female version, only where the sexuality of that woman is concerned, if it was something like prostitute, there would be 20 more synonyms. But everything else, not so many, right? So, of course, culture is always embedded within the language, and we live in a very patriarchal society where we see that in the language and the words. So, I'm not surprised by that. Of course, language changes. So then, culture changes, and tradition changes, and patriarchy is slowly kind of diminishing. So you see that also in the language. One way in which you see it, I don't, again, I'm not so much focused on words, rather on grammar and how it changes the language. One of them is using the feminine versions of the words. So in Macedonian we have gender. So we have both masculine and feminine nouns. But then traditionally we use the masculine form to mean both masculine and feminine. And this is a very contested issue, whether you use the feminine form or not. But in fact, the Academy of Sciences in Serbia, I think they came out with some kind of a decision that the feminine forms of the nouns are no longer they're not standard language. I'm not sure if it's a law, not really a law, but it's some kind of something that the editors are going to be doing, like taking out all the feminine words from the language, but definitely it's a recommendation that this is not something that you should do in the language, that it's ungrammatical, let's say, to use feminine words. It's not okay to use feminine words for things like lawyer, doctor, psychologist, composer, but it's okay if it's cleaner, right? And other professions that were normally attributed to women, but were also seen as a lower social, that had a lower social status. So for those, it's okay to have feminine forms. But for others that are now gaining feminine forms, they're saying, sorry, we're stopping it here. This is ungrammatical, right? Grammatically incorrect. I'm pushing I like to push the feminine forms in the language because it normalizes them. And who knows, maybe we'll get some kind of a different plural one day where it encompasses everything. But it's not something that I want to do artificially. I'm just using it on my own. If it catches on, fine. If it doesn't, that also shows that society is not ready for that. There's now a new generation of prose writers in Macedonia that I'm really enamored with. And I would recommend Petar Andonovski, Davor Stojanovski, Frosina Parmakovska. Those are some really good writers. Of course, Lidia Dimkovska is a wonderful writer who has been translated into English. And Goces Milevski has also been translated into English. Really, really interesting Macedonian writer as well. So we have a thriving prose scene. These are only 5 authors that I mentioned, but there's many more. I like the new generation because, unlike the older generations of Macedonian writers, they do incorporate the Macedonian society, the issues of transition. They look at the just the class differences also that exist in our society, but also this sense of loss that the young generations experience with their need somehow, or their desire to leave the country because they see it as not a place where they can flourish. And in a sense, I could say that there is this kind of lost generation that they portray in their novels. I see that also in Yugoslavian writing, and I think it has to do with the war. It has to do with this perceived, this perception of no future that a lot of the young people are seeing. And I'm seeing that, unfortunately, with also some of my students, with such high rates of unemployment. It's very difficult for students to think that they can have a prospect in such a small country that has been devastated by corruption and ethnic conflict, and sometimes and in the past wars. So that's something that these new generations are addressing, whereas in poetry there is a sense of escapism, where now we see even the new generations just kind of writing about their feelings. It's a lot of confessional poetry that's dealing with love, whereas the prose writers really kind of, I think, analyze the current situation in a subtle way. So I'm pretty proud of that new trend. My biggest challenge was translating the nonsense poems of Lewis Carroll. And you see that English is melodic in a different way. It's shorter, it's iambic, most of the meter is such. There's a lot of possibilities for rhyme, whereas Macedonian is not so. It's rhythmical, but in a different way, and it's much more difficult to create rhyming patterns. Whereas all these poems that you have in Lewis Carroll's works are rhyming. So that for me was really rough, trying to figure out how to do that and make it rhythmical, and make it also transfer also that kind of nonsense, which makes a lot of sense, in fact, if you look at it more profoundly. Then so I spent a lot of time on that, and it was rough. But then again, I decided not to do that after that because it took up so much of my time, and it was the greatest challenge, definitely. Then there is when you translate from a particular language into when you translate into your own language, there's a range of things that we could address in terms of challenges. Like if you think about challenges, one of them is technical. One of them is who you're translating for, what kind of deadline you have, how much you're getting paid, and who your editors are. In that, I would like to mention that we had a very strange situation happen in Macedonia in the past several years where the government commissioned a bunch of translations to be made in a very, very short amount of time. So it was a grandiose project that meant well, perhaps, but essentially I think it created a lot of irreparable damage. So I think maybe about, if I'm not mistaken, I don't know the exact number of books, but maybe it's up to 1,000, or I don't know, at least, but somewhere between 500 and 1,000 books of literature were translated in the course of 5 or 6 years. And you have to keep in mind that this is a country of 2 million people where not that many translators, really good translators, exist who can take on so many works in such a short amount of time for a very small amount of money as well. For some new publishing houses that suddenly sprang up as the government was commissioning these works to be translated via a government-sponsored project. So that was kind of fishy, I have to say. But essentially what happened was the translators, I was also involved in several of these. I translated Disgrace and In Cold Blood. I forgot to mention that. I translated In Cold Blood by Capote as part of that project. I had my scruples about whether I should get involved, but then I realized that if I didn't do it, somebody else would. From this perspective, I don't see that as an excuse. I think us translators should have been louder and should have actually said that we wouldn't participate in this project. But there wasn't such a critical outcry or even a critical atmosphere in Macedonia at the time, and there wasn't much solidarity, not the critical solidarity that we have now. And a lot of people just praised the project, and we sort of got involved in it. From this perspective, I wouldn't get involved. I'm happy that I translated those marvelous books, but I don't think that it's, from this perspective, it's ethical that we supported the project by actually participating in it. What happened was that we would translate the novels, we would translate the works, and then there was a committee, an editing committee, made up of people who worked in the Macedonian Academy or professors, notable people in the world of literature. And then they would look through, I don't know how they read. I don't think they would have been able to read so many books in 1 year, but supposedly they did. And then they would come up with, they would tell you whether this book was, whether they would publish the book in its form. And of course they would make changes. And a lot of the changes that they made were, if I look at it from this perspective, somehow purist in terms of language. They were imposing certain ideas onto the translator's work. So they thought that the Macedonian language needs to be, quote unquote, preserved. To them, preserved is using a language that is that we see in books. That's kind of the standardized Macedonian language, which is not the language that people speak. And I will quote my friend Ognan Chemirski, who was a fantastic translator. He said language is not a vegetable that you can preserve in a jar. Language grows and it changes, and translations are supposed to mirror that. So we had a pretty conservative committee that would do that would impose these kind of standardized Macedonian forms in the language. And let's say one particularly crazy thing that happened was that the translation of Huckleberry Finn had Huckleberry Finn speaking like a young, educated lad, and also Jim, the slave, was also speaking in the same manner. So everything that Huckleberry Finn is known for as one of the most important novels of American literature, and just the novel that signaled this use of natural language in literature is completely destroyed in our language without the consent of the translator, who didn't translate it that way. So this shows what happens when the government mingles, kind of interferes in the translation. The last challenge that I faced also is a personal challenge: how you connect to the work that you're translating, or I'm translating. Sometimes you don't really like what you're translating that much, and it's much more difficult. Sometimes you really admire it. For me, it's been rewarding to work on writers like Coetzee and Capote, because I absolutely admire how they write, and I think they taught me a lot about writing on my own, because you get into the depth of their structure of the sentences and the way in which they structure the text, and you know exactly what they're doing. So it helped me grow in terms of what I wanted to do with my writing, and they're very different in terms of my style, so it didn't really influence me. But it inspired me to definitely work on my own writing. Also, I had this really strange experience with both novels, where I was working in this house in the woods, and I was alone. There's other houses in that area, but they were not occupied. And there's a lot of animals around. There's bears and wolves and things like that. And so as children, we were always being scared that the bear will come, or that you'll see a wolf, or there's snakes. So, that nature is something to be afraid of. And I happened to translate both Disgrace and In Cold Blood while I was in that house. And it got really scary, because I then realized that it's people who are the real challenge, who are the real aggressors, not the bears or the wolves. There was a situation with the only neighbor who was there. I felt unsafe in his presence, and especially because of me being a woman and him being a man, and he actually owned a gun. He told me that. But also, it was interesting because I felt that was the thing that should get me away from that place, because I'm a woman and because I feel physically threatened by this man, that I should leave. And that if something happened to me, people would have said that I was asking for it because I was a woman alone in the woods. So I said to myself, I'm not leaving, because I'm not going to have that particular stereotype kind of get me out of my comfort zone, which was, me translating these great books in the woods. So nothing happened to me. I'm still alive and well.